And if I'd gotten to the last thing I had on that slide and hadn't been so pressed to end things, I would have said this. So Moravians were exempt from military service. That was part of the original deal with the British Parliament in 1749, was recognition of exemption from military service. Moravians finally officially lost that following Nat Turner's revolt. That's when the state of North Carolina said, we've got to be so afraid of our slaves that even Moravians are not exempt from military service anymore. Yes?
Wasn't it more that we will harbor troops in Salem unless you have your own regiment?
I don't know the details on that. Daniel Cruz may have more about that.
North Carolina passed a law, and each town had to have a militia or they would harbor state troops in that town.
Okay.
And that's when Salem really asked to go ahead and have their own.
Yeah, but for me, one of sort of the irony of that is the development of the racial attitudes and the loss of pacifism, are all sort of hand in glove.
Yeah, I was going to ask, is it possible there's some residual reaction to Moravian sympathy for the plight and personhood of America?
Yeah, and
not uniformly, but yet at least historically.
Yeah, and what is interesting is, just less than 10 years before this, St. Philip's becomes a separate entity. There are lots that could be said about that, but once again, that's more sort of, I refer you to Zinsbach on that, yeah.
And the Moravians kicked women out of leadership 10 years before that as well.
Right, 1818, that's the terminal date of things, right? And so that's why I say when you look at these trajectories, part of what I'm arguing is that Moravians, even though the original American vision is not Moravian, we over time buy into that vision. Okay? So even in Salem, women are not in positions of authority. There's increasing segregation. We're giving up pacifism. We're giving up our communal approaches to economies. So I want to move on to the second. Congregations and communities in the 20th century American context, and I'm sort of talking about a long 20th century, sort of going back to about 1890 and including going to where we are today. And for me, the important thing to note is at this point, Moravian communities are reactive. And I will say what I mean by that. As opposed to Moravians saying, we're going to go build the community we want, structured the way we want it, empowering people the way we want it, we are responding to what's going on around us. And to be honest, this is often a response to where do white people want to live and work? Okay?
Is that one reason why we haven't divided? We don't have the will to do that?
Why we haven't what?
The will to divide.
We haven't divided.
As a community, you mentioned earlier that we haven't had division or assimilation of other groups. Maybe we, because we know enough, we don't offer.
Yeah, that could be. I mean, you mean divided from among each other? Is that, or you mean dividing from society?
No, a church divides.
Yeah. I think part of that is, we've just sort of been going along with things, and we haven't had enough arguments.
We were, but it is what we were.
Yeah, and part of that vision has really been squelched over time. So, in the 1890s, here are the churches in the southern province that were started in the 1890s. And if you'll notice, Calvary, Wachovia Arbor, Fairview, Christ Church, and Bethesda are all new suburban areas that are growing up around Winston or Salem. And at that point, they're still Winston and Salem are separate cities. Wow. So these are new suburbs that are being created primarily for white people working in either mills or tobacco factories or in more sort of upscale neighborhoods as well. We'll get to that in a minute with Ardmore in the 1920s. What's interesting to note is that Henry Fries is building a cotton mill in the south of Salem. He also built one out at Mayodan. And you'll note that we have coming out of that a Mayodan Moravian Church, and by the 1920s we have Pine Chapel Moravian Church. Okay, so my point is that our growth in the early, and so this is like sort of after Reconstruction, as things begin to gear back up in the South for whites. Here's how the Moravian Church is growing. We'll go to where we're building houses for white people to live and work, and we'll start churches there. Okay. The same thing is true in the 1920s. I mentioned Ardmore, Pine Chapel. The other thing that's sort of interesting is that with the Sunday school movement and the desire to start Sunday schools in areas that are often near churches, but not really close enough for them to be actively engaged. You'll see Enterprise down here coming off of Friedberg, Mizpah out related to Bethania, Fulp also up in that area. Once again, you go over on the other side, New Eden is another sort of Winston-Salem area suburb. Advent, an offshoot from Friedberg as a Sunday school, and I think which started earlier. I don't have Trinity in there. Yeah, because what Trinity actually started in.
Centerville Chapel in the 90s, and then that became Trinity in 1990.
Yeah, so that sort of falls in the cracks of when it officially became a church, but the Centerville work, was started in the 1890s. So there's the idea of trying to be able to travel to neighboring areas to start churches that flourished during this time. And Leakesville is another example. After Mayodan got up and running, Leakesville is a Sunday school movement church out of that. Yeah.
Why didn't the Moravian Church reach out to black populations? And when did the Methodists and the Baptists start doing that after 1870?
Well, the Methodists and the Baptists really make that a thrust of their mission much earlier, in the early 1800s. And by that point,
Before the Civil War?
yes. Yeah. So the revival movements, which the Moravian Church had a real contentious relationship with, that's going on as early as the 18 teens and 20s. And part of the idea of St. Philip's is to give an experience for African Americans so they're not running off to the camp meetings. So they are making, like I said, Methodists and Baptists are with the African American communities much earlier than that. Yeah.
Is this a result of, Moravians procreating and then moving out to farther areas? Oh, we need a church for this community that's there? Or was this intentional, there's a community, let's send, the equivalent of a church planter to go?
No, I think there were people who knew of Moravians, but it's not like we said, oh, the Liberty area is opening up, so we're going to ask, 10 Moravian families to move there and there'll be the core of a church. No, it was more like as places opened up, a lot of developers would just leave space for churches, and Moravian churches took some of those slots, assuming that they would be able to grow. So once again, but it's a good question, and the point is important. These were not intentional. We're going to move Moravians to this area to be Moravian, whereas that's how we used to do things. Yeah?
You said the Moravian Church was going to white areas.
Mm-hmm.
Is that really because they were just white, or because that's really known?
Well, part of what happens is the African American community is expanding, and we're not putting efforts to go where those African American communities are expanding. I don't think anybody, here's where it would have been helpful to have a little more, I'm trying to remember her name, who's done some work on the history of African American communities here. At this point, I would argue that most people really don't care where African Americans live. You know, so that's part of why they're not building new housing.
It isn't their neighborhood.
Right, right. And once they move in, you know, because Freeze Memorial was originally, you know, up near MLK Drive and moved to where it is in the 40s. Fairview was originally up on 52, moved to where it is in the 60s. So as those African American communities moved up, there was white flight. And once again, this is not just Moravians. If you look at the churches that are along Silas Creek Parkway, the big Methodist Church, the big Presbyterian Church, the Moravian Church, they were all churches up in northeast Winston that moved over that way. And then there were a lot of new church plants, once again, to move to the suburbs that white folks are moving into. So I don't think intentionally anybody said, we're not going where African Americans are. But the Moravian Church was already vast majority white. And so it's like, where are white people going? We're going to go there. Okay. Okay. So I want to say some things. Not only did where we were going, you know, expand on some pretty specific patterns, and once again, this is where questions related to the difference between systemic or institutional racism, which are different from, you know, personal biases, come into play. And so like I said, I don't think anybody intentionally said, we don't want to go where black people are, but we only thought about going where white people were going. That's sort of a systemic issue. There are other systemic things that are happening during the 20th century that greatly change the nature of community life. And one of those is air conditioning. Now, I expect many people here may have grown up without air conditioning. I certainly did. What happened, those of you who grew up without air conditioning, what happened when you got AC in your house? Close the doors. What?
Stood in front of it.
Okay, closed the door, stood in front of it, stayed inside. Okay. This is what America started doing as America, and same certainly true for Winston-Salem. As we got air conditioning, we weren't outside, we weren't interacting with people, we were inside doing our thing. And we actually changed how we designed houses, especially here in the South. Yeah, into the front porch. Into things called sleeping porches. I remember my dad talking about that they had a porch off the back that was screened in on really, when it got so hot in the house, they would sleep outside. There were houses, it used to have a whole lot more windows and things to be able to get a good cross breeze going. So it literally changed how America lived, okay? And one of the things it did is it forced us inside. So we're inside. Part of what that means is we're not on our front porch, we're not interacting with neighbors, we're not able to help police the neighbors' kids or help the neighbors police our kids, right? Communities raising children. You used to hear a whole lot more about that, not so much anymore, because everybody's inside where it's cool. I know John Jackman likes this. One of the first places to be air conditioned were movie theaters. So you could get tons of people together in one cool space. It was a very efficient way to cool off. And golden era of Hollywood, because all these people want to come to movie theaters now, okay? So that's one of the things that does too is it changes a social location. Where do people gather? In an old church that's not air conditioned? No, we'll go to the movie theater that is air conditioned, right? So air conditioning changes how Americans live, it changes our architecture, it changes how we interact. Same thing's true of television, okay? Once again, and by the way, air conditioning is like the most rapidly adapted technology in American history, okay? Television also greatly changes things because everybody's around the TV. We're inside, and that's what people do, okay? Another one that we often don't think of very much is highways. Greatly change American life. And who has access to what kind of transportation, which means access to what kind of health care, or access to what kind of shopping, or access to what kind of education. This is a short 4.5 minutes on what the highway system did to cities. Once again, to make it personal, they're not talking about Winston-Salem in this documentary, but let's talk about 52, okay? When 52 was put in, it actually took out, it radically changed 2 Moravian churches. One of which was, what was the other one? Freed's Memorial had already changed. They'd made their move. St. Philip's. So it's interesting, the one African American church that we have, and they had moved on several occasions, including before 52 went through, a location on Vargrave Street, and Daniel Cruz points out that they had moved there with promises from the city planners that if they moved there, their church and their community would not be disturbed. Well, 52 went through, took that property, and St. Philip's had to move up to its current location. The other one to be really greatly affected is Fairview, because when 52 came in, it took a lot of their property. They'd had a scout hut there, parking, and as that community had changed, a lot of Fairview folks had already moved over to the west side of town, but losing property and stuff like that was sort of the final straw. And so that's one of the things that I want to point out. We often think that our racial attitudes don't affect white people, but they do. So 2 Moravian churches greatly affected by 52. And it's like we're so used to 52, we forget that it wasn't always there. It could have easily been built where Stratford Road is now. But look at the houses that would have been demolished if they had chosen to build it there. And that's why 52 is not there. Okay? All right, so hopefully we'll get sound now, and we'll talk about this sort of on a broader scale with some of the issues that this raises.
It's hard to picture American cities without the highways running through their core. But highway removal projects like this one in Boston can give us a sense of how disruptive it was when the U.S. built huge highways through the cities after World War II.
These new highways will have a far-reaching economic impact on the entire nation.
That was definitely true. Highways revolutionized the way we transport goods. But inside cities, they demolished and isolated entire neighborhoods. They gave wealthy taxpayers a way out of the city and gave air pollution and traffic noise a way in. And they redesigned urban life around the car. Now 85% of Americans drive to work every day. So why did American cities agree to build highways that were bad for cities?
It's a really interesting question, and part of it actually goes all the way back to the 1930s, when a group of auto interests, such as General Motors, AAA, formed something called the National Highway Users Conference.
They began lobbying for taxes that would help fund highway construction. General Motors started to design what a new highway system could look like, and they displayed that vision at the 1939 World's Fair with Futurama, an exhibit featuring expressways that not only connected cities, but ran right through them. It was a design that allowed for more cars and less congestion. By 1955, the Department of Commerce echoed GM's vision with something called the Yellow Book. It laid out all the routes that interstates would take throughout the country under Eisenhower's Federal Highway Act of 1956, which funded the national highway system.
A lot of it's logical. It's, connecting most of the U.S.'s major cities. But the really interesting thing is you also have highways slicing right through the downtowns of many of these cities. Pretty much every major city in the country, New York, D.C., San Francisco, Philadelphia, you have major highways cutting through neighborhoods, requiring the demolition of lots of housing and other sorts of buildings.
That's largely because some of the key contributors to the plan were auto industry members, but no urban planners.
And that's because the profession barely even existed at the time. Nowadays, there's a value placed on preserving neighborhoods, on keeping cities intact, and that concept just really didn't even exist in the 40s and 50s. When people were talking about connecting the country with highways, it seemed pretty natural just to drive highways through the center of cities as well.
Local municipalities were particularly eager to build highways under this plan because 90% of funding came from the federal government, and the other 10% from states.
There's also a darker side to the reason why all these planners wanted to build highways through downtowns and urban neighborhoods.
highways not only paved the way for more and more white people to move into homogeneous suburbs, they also provided cover for targeted demolitions inside the city.
During that era, federal policies and implicit priorities of planners dictated that you had, vibrant, dense downtown neighborhoods filled mostly with African American residents. Instead of being preserved under the plan, they were slated as targets for removal. They were considered blight, and an easy way of getting rid of that blight was by demolishing them and paving a highway through it.
Neighborhoods and streetcars were pushed aside to make way for the automobile.
Look at the neighborhoods of Black Bottom and Paradise Valley in Detroit.
When you go back to the 30s and 40s, these are thriving, dense neighborhoods filled with hundreds of thousands of residents, of businesses, and if you go back today, they're mostly just empty grass plots.
This wasn't just a historical accident. It became a pattern in cities across the country. Poor and minority residents were displaced to make way for highways, and white residents used those highways to commute into the city for jobs and commute back home at night.
The only exception to this pattern is in places where highways were slated to go through wealthy neighborhoods.
There were actually proposals to put a highway through Northwest DC and through Greenwich Village in Manhattan. But you can guess what happened there.
Anywhere where residents had the means to organize and protest, they were often able to stop the highways from being built. Whereas in places where residents didn't have the political capital and other sorts of privileges that allow you to do that, their neighborhoods ended up being demolished, and they're now highways today.
Even before he signed the Federal Highway Act of 1956, Eisenhower was already a really big fan of highways in general. Part of that has to do with his time in Germany during World War II, where he realized how important it is to have a good system of highways to transport goods and people very efficiently, but also has to do with this military road trip that he took in 1919, where he went all the way from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco, California. And that road trip took 62 days at the time, and today it takes about 42 hours. And part of that had to do with the state of cars at the time, but it also had to do with the state of roads at the time. And after seeing that, he realized that 62 days was way too long to wait in any situation where they might need to defend the country. And that's where he became such a big fan of highways.
Okay, so that's something that I had never really thought about. But actually the evidence had been around me for a long time in several different ways. I lived in Durham for a while and was aware of a community called the Hayti area of Durham. And later found out that at one time that had been called the Black Wall Street, and that the largest African American owned insurance agency had started there. But when Durham was dealing with highway issues, that community was decimated because of where the expressways were put through. And made it a whole lot easier to get rich folks from New Jersey to come to Duke. So once again, some of the systemic issues are really important. Like I said, each of these has contributed in huge ways to the way we live. And one thing to think about is like, who here goes to a church in the city of Winston-Salem? How close do you live to your church?
5 blocks.
30 minutes, 35 miles, 8 miles, 5 miles, 5 blocks, okay? So there are very few people here who still, live near their churches, but most of us, take advantage of these highway systems that allow churches to be incredibly dispersed. Once again, think about how different that is than the original vision of the people who founded the Wachovia congregations. It's easy to go to church every night when all you have to do is walk up the street. Passion Week is like one of the few things that we have left of that, and that's easy to do, if everybody's close by, but get really spread out, and it's hard to deal with that. So that's one of the challenges that a lot of our churches face, because I'll go back a couple slides. If we look at this list of churches that were built on, the idea of suburbs and having a church near where people are living, and add to that the fact that the 6 congregations that existed in the 18th century were all founded around that same concept, you're living and working close to your church, and then take into the fact that very, very few of us could be, are a part of that model now, it's no wonder that a lot of our churches have difficulties trying to figure out how to do stuff, because we were based on a model that no longer exists in terms of how we live, how we work, and how we interact with people. Okay? Yes?
In some ways, one of the contributing factors, I think, was desegregation and the busing that went with that and destroyed nuclear schools. So what I'm trying to say is we are in a transition that isn't always womb-big, and we need to go back to that. We're in the midst of transition, which allows us to try to envision a new model that works today.
Right, so this question of what new models are is really important. And as I pointed out, all of these are reactive models. There's part of me that says, okay, Moravians, if we are aware that we're in a time of transition, that we're looking at how we're going to do things differently, are there ways that we can be more proactive? What kind of communities would we like to create, and how? Or how do we plug into communities that already exist but may not, we don't have a good way of sharing the gospel there yet? So that's what I'm saying. What are the models that we would like to work with rather than being stuck with the models that we were handed? Because let's be honest, and like I said, the last sort of suburban churches that the Moravian Church tried to create within this area, Con Oak Hills, 1951, Messiah, 1951, Good Shepherd in Kernersville, and that was not a terribly successful model. It's now closed. And then Unity, and it depends on how you would count Unity as a suburb or not, a suburban church. And that was founded, 1990 roughly? It's like 36 years old. Yeah, okay. So more like 1980, okay. So, like I said, we've gone away from trying to grow that way. And what we're experiencing is that most of the congregations that were built on that model are experiencing difficulties, trying to figure out how to find ways forward. Because we simply don't live the way those churches were designed to serve. Okay. All right, so here's just some figures. So what I have here is Southern Province membership from the period that I'm talking about here in Arc 2. Right, so this is 1890 to the present. And what's interesting to note is that we're at like about 3,000 right here in 1890, okay? And so there's actually as much history of Moravians in North Carolina going this way as there is going this way. So this is a midpoint. And I mentioned earlier that in 1790, there are roughly 1,100, between 1,100 and 1,200 Moravians. And we'd only gotten to about 3,000 in the next 100 years. And then look what happens as we followed this suburban model. Okay, so part of what I would like to say about that is that was very successful for a while. Moravians experienced tremendous growth during this period. So I'm not, from a church planting perspective or from a church growth perspective, that was a really, really good model. But I'm not sure that that's a good model for us to try to say we want to follow, because of all those changes that started happening around 1950. Okay? So here, yeah.
In this growth, you say it was a good model to follow, but were we reaching out to unchurched people, or just going where the church people were moving to?
That's a good question. I would say that at least in some cases, because what you see in general happening is that Americans are becoming more engaged in church life during this period. If you go back to the colonial period, the overall population is not very engaged in church life. And so there is a growing sense of that. So there would be a sense of reaching out to people who were not previously part of the church. So there is some growth through that. Yeah.
In 10 significant cities in the United States, and a dispersion graph of how repopulation of downtown and the wasteland of mid-level suburbia, not all the way out, but midway out. Suburbia is the new wasteland.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting if you go, just look and see what houses have been for sale, how long. I mean, you can see this showing up in lots of different ways. So we are experiencing some major transitions, right? And that's part of the issues that we as a church face. Because like I said, we were based on a suburban model when we don't live that way anymore, okay? So a couple of things to note. Here's how in terms of congregation numbers, here's how the church expanded. In the 1890s, there were 10 new churches started, and 6 of them were in the greater Winston-Salem area. When you take those numbers all the way through the 1950s, you see that there were 32 new church starts, and 20 of them are around Winston-Salem. So for the first half of this, or the third quarter of the history of the Southern Province, we're still very much Winston-Salem focused. Okay. So there are a couple of things to think about when we talk about this growth, and this sort of goes back to your question about, were we reaching out to new people, or were we sort of shuffling the decks, or were we growing purely by procreation? And I think one of the questions is, what's the operative theology that was being presented as part of the Sunday school movement? So I've presented this idea that the Zinzendorf era had a very creative theology that was very open to women in leadership, even people of color. So that was the theology that was in place at that point. As we noted, Moravians really backed off of that. And so part of the question is, what replaced that? Yeah?
A quick question. I'm not sure I quite understand when you say Sunday school.
Okay.
What does that mean?
Okay, so the Sunday school movement was something that was going on in the 1890s in many places. Okay, so there were big publishing houses that would put together materials that were part of the Sunday school movement. And it was not just the Moravian Church, but lots of Protestant churches this was going on. And it dealt with sort of this whole, as cities expanded into suburb areas, what would happen is you would have a big church somewhere, and they would send people like on a Sunday afternoon. And we know that this happened out of Salem. Bishop Rontaler was an important figure related to this. And so especially with cars, sometimes, if a church had a member or a pastor with a car, then that made it easier to go to places where people didn't have cars, and so they couldn't come into your worship service, but you could go to them. And so what would happen, and so here's a topic, sort of a future study that I'm interested in, is what were the role of women in that? Because I think a lot of it was you had women Sunday school teachers who were going out and doing the work. And what would happen is they would go and meet in somebody's house, or they would meet in a storefront. And if you got enough people together on a regular basis for Sunday schools, and some of it literally was educational, because this is before public schools and all that kind of stuff. So there is some educational part of it, but it's also worship and stuff like that. So you would go there, and if you got critical mass, then that would become a church. And so a Fairview originally was up just south of the airport. You can see the back end of Fairview. The church building is still there. It's right when you come around that bend. And so that would have been easy driving distance, but a bit of a walk to come in for a regular worship service. So you could drive out there, do Sunday schools, and they actually had about 3 buildings where they met before they actually built a church. Fairview's currently on its 4th church building. And so Centerville, was there a house, or do you know much of the story of?
They built a wooden
But did they meet in somebody's house to start with, or a storefront, or? Yeah, and so that was true, so that was true in many cases. That there was the Elm Street revival. Christ gets started the same way. There's Sunday schools, and so example, Advent. Advent's a big Sunday school church, and it was a Sunday school with people from Friedberg. But and that history of the Sunday school is so powerful that for a long time, people would come to Sunday school but not stay for church.
That was still true when I was there in the 70s. Sunday school was I thought Sunday school was what you did on Sunday morning. Worship was just a, what? Postscript.
Yeah. So, and part of it too, like I said, there was a change in theology, and we got more into sort of, that period is characterized by sort of more evangelical, and I mean that with a little e, issues of personal relationship and personal salvation, as opposed to a community orientation that was part of the Zinzendorf time. Okay, and I think that's one of the things I find interesting. Like I said, Fairview's a Sunday school church. Wow. So there's this history of, they had these books called Spiritual Life Songs. It wasn't the hymnal, it was this paperback book, and it had been published by Broadman Press or something like that. And these paperbacks had been so used. I mean, they were obviously well loved and well worn, called Spiritual Life Songs. But it was all about, I come to the garden alone, there's victory in Jesus, it's all it's me and Jesus kind of stuff, and how am I living, and have I been saved? And even though it's Spiritual Life Song, there were no titles that reference the Holy Spirit at all. It's all a very personal you and Jesus kind of focus, which, like I said, a relationship with Jesus is important. But the Moravian ideal was that was expressed in a community. It wasn't just me and Jesus. Okay, so that's sort of why I raised questions about what the operative theology is. So in addition to sort of the communal aspects or the community aspects that we're facing because we're not in suburbs anymore, and that was the model, I think we're also facing some underlying theological questions. So when people do then, encounter sort of more communal spiritual approaches from the Moravian history, sometimes there's some tension, and it's sort of hard to figure out how those work together.
I think one of the things we don't recognize in the Salem community that is the Moravian experience is the influence that the Congregational Separatist movement of Shubal Stern in Sandy Creek had on us, Randolph County, and the regulators and the Revolutionary War and all that, and that has impacted the culture and has been more pervasive for determining a lot of Sunday school-based congregations than Moravian theology.
Yeah, so that's once again where those questions of what publishing houses are putting out, what kinds of things that Moravians are using. That's another way that influence may be coming in. Yeah, and so this was one of the questions that I raised, and this would be interesting to see, are there ways that the Sunday school movement actually tapped into but used in a different way sort of women's engagement and authority within the Sunday school movement? So here are some things sort of to note within the within Moravian membership in the Southern Province. We actually peaked in the early 70s, okay? One of the things that I sort of point out for that is that means that the vast majority of our pastors have experienced their entire pastoral career as part of a province that's dealing with shrinking numbers and shrinking resources. And that's part of our perception. We're going to hold questions. We'll talk. All right. And so this is where our current numbers are. Here's if you explode just sort of that part of the graph, this is what we're looking at in terms of our numbers from 1970 to the current time. I think one of the biggest questions that the church wrestles with now is what is going to be the legacy of what Tom Brokaw called the greatest generation. Okay? And a couple of things to note about that is I think sort of there's a stability that happened from 1950 to 1990. And that's sort of interesting, sort of the Eisenhower years through the Reagan years. And for a lot of churches, if you go back and look in Moravian churches, those were times of growth. Things began to level off near the end of it. But, you know, that's sort of a lot of good old days for a lot of people's actually personal memory for folks who were around then. And part of that is because the greatest generation grew up during the Depression, then there was World War II, and then there was a time of scarcity sort of after World War II, just because resources had to get diverted to creating a peacetime economy, and there were housing shortages and stuff like that. And then it's like the doors were wide open. So you have a generation of people who defeated Hitler's empire, won World War II. There were all sorts of technological developments that happened during World War II. There were advances in medicine that happened during World War II. And after, in 1950, all of that got focused on a post-war consumer economy. And when you look at life expectancies, one of the interesting things is when people got back from World War II, that greatest generation, there weren't a whole lot of older folks around telling them, nah, here's the way we do things, right? Because people just died earlier and they had invented a lot of the technology, so nobody was going to be able to tell them how to use it. They just sort of took it and ran. So, and I think the same thing happened in the church, and this is something that I would like to study at greater depth, is who was sitting on the boards in 1950? In Moravian churches. Okay, yes, so men's going to be one of the obvious answers. But, how old were they? What were their experiences? And how long did they stay on the boards? And I think what you would see is that the greatest generation was able to provide a great amount of leadership to the Moravian Church for a very long time. And on one hand, that's a great thing, right? You're living longer, you're more vital, you're more active, you've got experience, that's great. Part of the problem was then some of their kids, baby boomers, they became adults, and it was just like, okay, we're ready to sit at the table now too. We'd like to have a voice in things. And then sometimes it was like, we've got it, thank you. We're doing pretty well. Appreciate your interest, but we're still working on things. And the greatest generation in a lot of ways just sort of kept doing that for a long time. And so a lot of baby boomers got frustrated and went somewhere else. And I think that's one of the reasons that we see a rise of mega churches. And going back to the question of who are you reaching, a lot of mega churches claim that they've reached a lot of seekers, but I think a lot of it was actually that it was built on the spiritual capital of mainline Protestantism. I think there were a lot of people who grew up in the church, and when they were ready to sort of use their gifts and talents, church didn't have a place for them. So, I'll go and we'll start this. And lots of mega churches arose up out of that. So that's another thing that I would like to research in greater depth. One of the things that then happened is then the greatest generation, some of them retired. Now I've got more time to spend at church. And so rather than creating more space for baby boomers or younger generations to do stuff, as they sort of double down and keep things rolling. And then, I know this anecdotally from Fairview, there were people who were like, man, I've been doing this a long time and I'm ready to step down. And it's just like, but there's nobody to take my place. And they would say, we kind of shot ourselves in the foot. We should have done a better job of cultivating younger leadership. And we realize now that was, it made sense at the time, but now we realize we don't have people ready to take our place. And so I think that's one of the big transitions that's happening too. So when you look at those graphs, for the southern province, you see all this growth that happens, And you see the decline of it is as the greatest generation is beginning to die off, okay? And what's interesting is this number, this section, about right here, you see there's a little bump up. This is Moravian churches in Florida. So the growth in Florida actually, it masks some decline that's happening in Winston-Salem, because realistically these numbers should be lower through here, okay? So the Moravian Church in Florida really is having an impact on the southern province, okay? So, like I said, the nature of the greatest generation, I think, is something that really has impacted the growth of the Moravian Church in the southern province and sort of its character for the last half of the 20th century. And that's part of the reason I say that I think the spiritual legacy of the baby boomers has yet to be written. Because a lot of baby boomers, their parents were, and in some cases still are, very important members of the church or impact their lives in ways that affect what they're able to do. And I have to say that, I was young when both my parents died, so this is something that hadn't impacted me personally, and I'm always shocked when I run into people and they're still taking care of their mom and their dad, and they're worried about their kids and trying to wonder why their grandkids aren't in church. So the church is dealing with 4 generations of people in many places. And this would have been unheard of a generation ago. Very rarely, would you have somebody who was really old, and so there might be 4 generations in their family. But there are lots of 4-generational families now that are asking all sorts of questions about how they're going to live and how they're going to participate and how we get church programming for whoever. So I want to jump ahead to a couple of things. Yeah, just fun fact. When a couple married in 1800, they could expect to live together for 16 years before, there was a disease that came through, somebody, got kicked in the head by a horse, somebody died in childbirth, there was a war, whatever, 16 years. In 1990, a couple could expect to live for 48 years before one of the spouses died. Okay, so huge changes in how American life works. Okay, so one of the things that's interesting to note is we have reinstituted the ordination of women. And so just a couple of figures that I'll throw out real quick. Since we reinstituted the ordination of women, we've had 29 called, appointed lay or acolyte women serving the southern province, okay? And they've had 37 calls and 10 interims. Roughly half of our congregations have experienced female leadership at some point in their lifetime, if you add in the interims, okay? So, like I said, 38 have actually called, 38% of the congregations, a little over a third, have actually had a called female pastor. We've still got a lot of work to do. Women are 17% of the pastorate, but they only receive 13% of the calls. Women are generally not called to our largest churches. When you consider the attendance figures, 3 of the top 5 have never called a woman, and only 1 of the top 10 has ever called more than 1 woman in terms of attendance, 1 of the top 10. Only 18% of our congregations have ever had a woman as the solo or head pastor. Women's calls tend to last 5.8 years. Men's calls on average are 7.6 years. This means that men serve on average 31% longer at a call than women do. This NFBCOR, it means a call that's not followed by another call or by retirement, okay? So if a woman has a call, the question is that call then followed by a call to another church, or does that woman retire, meaning she didn't want another call? Okay. 52% of the completed pastorates in the southern province have not been followed by a call or by retirement, which means a woman wanted to continue working as a pastor and was not able to do so immediately. Okay? That happens for only 25% of men. Okay? So you take these two figures together, women serve shorter pastorates and they're less likely to have a call on the other side of it. It means that women in the South still have a huge difficulty in having a pastoral vocation, a career as a pastor. A couple other numbers. Currently in the southern province, 11% of our congregations and 10% of our attendants have a female pastor. This is behind Canada, where a quarter of the churches have female pastors, and it's 16% of the attendants. The most progressive is the Western District, where 34% of the congregations and 34% of the attendants has a woman pastor currently. Okay, we've only got a third of that. Okay, so remember that original vision, women in leadership, women being able to exercise authority? You know, we are way behind our Moravian brothers and sisters here in America on this. So we currently have 6 women under call to congregations. Only one of them is at one of the top 10 churches in terms of attendance. The good news is of those 6, their average right now is 5 years, so they're approaching that average that we were talking about, and they seem to be in stable, healthy situations. 4 of those are first calls. So it means they've been able to stay through a good first call, have good experiences there. Okay, one last note. Yes, all right. So one of the questions that we talk about is budgets and finances. How are we going to do things? So and part of the question is, how much is enough? It's like I say, sometimes when we talk about new visions, well, we don't have a Zinzendorf to fund that. Right, we don't have a Zinzendorf to fund that, but we've got us. So let's talk about us for a little bit. It's estimated that Protestants in America give about 2.5 to 3% of their income to the church. Okay? Paul McLaughlin estimates that Moravians are probably more like 4% or something like that. So we're a little above average. Okay? What was that? The net worth of the Moravian Church in America, though, is staggering. In terms of what's estimated by available public records, something like the net worth of Moravians in North America is about $15 billion. So, like I said, if we wonder where the money might come from, and we're giving 2.5 or 3%, what would happen if everybody gave 1% more of their income? Okay? So, like I said, I'm giving 2%, I make, what's an easy figure to come up with? If I make $10,000 a year, right, and I'm giving 2%, what is it, Don, right off the, $200, all right. So, I'm not saying increase your giving by 1%, but increase the amount of your income that you give by 1%. All right, so that means if I were to increase from 2% to 3%, I'm giving, instead of $200, I'm giving $300. Okay? Not a huge jump for me, but what would it mean if everybody in our church did that? So if everybody went from giving 4% to 5%, it means our budget increases 25%. Boy, now we're getting important. That Carolina game's supposed to start at those automatic calendar reminders. Ugh. Okay. Yeah, so if everybody gave 1% more of their income, like I said, most church budgets would jump 25%. Another question is to find out and ask in your church, who is giving nothing and why? I was at a stewardship presentation at one of the Moravian churches in the north, and they had broken things out. They had one of these stair steps of giving kind of thing, and of their giving units, 34% had given nothing. Another 17% gave less than $5 a week. So that means over half the congregation, half the giving units, was giving less than it would take a family of 4 to go to McDonald's one time over the course of a month. Okay? And I think most people probably have the capacity to do that. I know there's some that don't, but most people probably have the capacity to think, okay, I could jump, and these people could jump 2 levels on the level of giving just by saying, I will pay what it takes to take my family to McDonald's one time this month. So when we think about things, that's another thing that'd be interesting to think is, what if we actually tithed? What would our budget look like? Just as a pie in the sky thing to put out for folks, right? And we talk about, okay, well, how would we afford to do this? Well, what if we started making commitments toward that and working toward that? What would a tithing budget look like? It means that for most Moravian churches, if your budget was $100,000 and you're giving, and that's an average of 4%, a tithing budget means your budget just jumped to $250,000. Okay? What if you even said, okay, what's a 5% budget or a 6% budget? Just to put it out there to get people thinking. I think another thing that's interesting is, what do we call the building? What do we call the building that we're in? In the 18th century, Moravians worshiped in zals. They were multi-purpose, multifunctional buildings that you could be there for worship, you could have a meal there, you could do all sorts of things there. Most of our churches have sanctuaries with fixed pews where it's really hard to do anything other than have a worship service. Okay? So when I teach students in the courses where we talk about this, I encourage them to think about their facilities. What are your congregation's facilities? And part of the reason I say that is, if you look at the word, you can see in that facile, Latin word that means easy, facilitate, what makes something happen. Do our facilities actually make ministry happen? And if they don't, maybe that's not the best use of that asset. Because that's another thing. A lot of congregations have a huge asset that's called their building, right? But do we use it wisely? Can we use it efficiently? And if we can't, what questions might that raise for us? Okay? So on that question, I'll sort of stop and just sort of say that if you look at this last trajectory, I want to point out that as opposed to intentionally, proactively building intentional communities, for the past 100 years, Moravians have been reactively doing ministries in suburbs. And maybe it's time to think about something different. Thank you.